So, and if, yeah, if anyone, they'll pipe up on Slack. I'll watch Slack. So we had office hours yesterday. Thanks for everyone who came. I think we had a pretty interesting discussion, so I wanted to reprise that for today. But to get to a topic that didn't make the cut last time, I think we should discuss sort of gateway and routes scope for cross namespace use cases. I think this is a pretty detailed write-up, so maybe we can pull that one up. So in terms of use cases, as the application developer living in a single namespace, you should create a load balancer to target single namespace. That makes sense. For a cluster operator for multiple teams, we'll like single load balancer service across multiple namespaces. I think this is like a common ask that we've had, where ingress cannot balance across namespaces. For a route, similar exists. You want to sort of be able to balance the services across namespaces. So let's see, different resources similar to role and cluster role. Let's see what this looks like down below. So you have a gateway, you have HTTP route, okay. And then the roles, HTTP route. Where does the roles come in? Cluster HTTP route.
He's
I see.
Creating like a cluster X and a cluster gateway and a gateway.
I see.
Cluster scoped one versus the non-cluster scoped one.
Yeah, the meaning of the cluster scope, I think, is less RBAC related, and it creates duplication in the resources, which I'm hoping that if we can avoid it, we should. Because if you give someone a role to modify those, it's sort of like modifying globals across your cluster. What would be better to see is like, basically there would be a NetOps namespace that would be given more rights or something. And then everything is done there instead of dumping it into the global space. Because once you have a global space on the cluster level, it becomes hard to, like, that's it. Like, you can't control it in any other way.
Yeah, so the way that we did this in HTTP proxy was just to make it so that you can span them across namespaces, but by default, if you don't supply a namespace, it will just look in the same namespace. And then so it's kind of that is an example where in general in Contour we try to make it so you can't accidentally shoot yourself in the foot, but in this case you'd have to work pretty hard to shoot yourself in the foot, because you need to know what the name of the object is in the other namespace that you're going to, and so you need to like at least have read access to the other namespace to do that.
Yeah, is Yang on the call? I think he's the one who filed this issue.
Yeah, I don't think he's here.
Yeah, what do other folks think about? I hesitate to create lots of cluster scoped things because they tend to be quite, like, you can't, once you give someone cluster scope permissions, it's kind of like they are a super user on some level. And we would not want to immediately go there in terms of constructing these things. I know, Daniel, did you have, I thought I saw some user stories from you as well around around selection and so forth?
Yeah, I forget what the poll is offhand. Give me 1 second here. Are you talking about the PR number 12, which is refactors gateway API type to use label selectors?
Yeah, maybe we can pull that one up.
Which seems like it does have some relevance to this PR 83, at least in the kind of the YAML example that was provided. It looks like there is some kind of example of using selectors for specifying namespaces and whatnot.
So I think this one, you have a route selector that across all namespaces associated to the gateway. So maybe Daniel, you can kind of walk us through kind of what your design was for this.
Hey, give me 1 second. Let me pull it up here.
It's been a while.
Yeah, yeah. Most of I've been tied up in some other stuff last couple of days, but yeah, most of my brain power has been going to kind of the TLS stuff. But anyways, yeah. So with this PR, I mean, my thought, the background here is, previous to this PR, to create that association or binding between a route and a gateway, it was basically just specifically referencing the route object, or the object by a name and namespace. So my thinking was, wow, that can get pretty tedious, pretty annoying when we're starting to talk, hundreds or potentially thousands of routes. It would really be nice to have some other mechanism that allows us to create that association or binding. And kind of going with the flow with the service APIs. I mean, I looked out in out in the wild for implementation references, and this is similar to what Istio does when it binds a gateway to a gateway deployment for Istio. It uses selectors, and so that's basically what I got this from. But yeah, I mean, the route selector allows us to go ahead and still have that backward compatibility, where we can just create the route refs, right? Direct references to the objects, or we can use a namespace selector or label selector. So selectors basically saying namespace, any, so this is where we just list the namespaces of routes, and any routes that exist within that namespace would be bound to the gateway. And
Sorry,
kind of.
Can I clarify? Like, is the concern still the number of routes that could potentially appear here in this object if you don't do a selector approach?
No, I think I guess I'm curious if this suffices for some of those use cases that were brought up in that PR.
Okay, I just wanted to point out that even if you still only had the straightforward explicit association where you have to refer to a route and there is no selector-based mechanism, for example, I think you probably still could achieve it with another intermediating piece, I guess, that could do the updating of the route references on behalf of the user, for example, with some arbitrary permissions model. So it doesn't have to be, you wouldn't necessarily have to give the end user, for example, permission to update the gateway. You could add something in between, I guess, that could have permission to update the gateway. That could make that decision based on some other arbitrary rules. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was, I think, someone brought it up before. I would be curious though, in terms of making it concrete,
yeah,
I would like to see either we can point to something and then tell people how to do it, or we would consider it just a, hits most use cases kind of thing and put it in the API. What kind of thing would you have in mind? Something like OPA or a custom code? What would be that extra thing?
Yeah, and I bring it up to just if we agree that it would be possible to imagine something like that, then that would be a way out of introducing any other API around selector.
Right.
For now, for example, you punt on it basically.
Oh, I see. I would like to, if we're going to punt on it, to kind of understand what that would be, though.
Sure.
Could we point to a system that exists or something very similar that people could get things done?
I guess I could write. It's I could write a controller, that its configuration would be what namespaces it would allow to be admitted into the gateway, for example, and it would be responsible for updating the gateway. So it would be like, does that make sense?
Yeah. The question there would be, why not just put it in this? This
Oh
one?
yeah,
It's
sure.
gonna be a complicated.
Yep, totally fair. Yeah, I just wanted to like throw it out there as the counter argument for it.
Right. No, I think someone has mentioned that before.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think, okay, so I've just updated it to cross-reference yours, Damien. And to make progress, I think either we can kind of, one thing I would like to see is if we can work through some of the RBAC, because this one doesn't, I don't think it actually includes the RBAC that you would be writing. And that would be good to figure out whether A, what the RBAC would be, and then B, is it sufficient for sort of handling the use cases? So like those are like the two main things. Because with that,
Let me. I'm going to add a to-do on that PR for myself to kind of go back and sketch out what the RBAC would look like for adding this functionality.
Yeah, I think unfortunately Kubernetes RBAC is not like as expressive as I think we need for some of these things. So that's an interesting exercise to go through.
Yeah, so we actually had a similar problem with this in Contour and solved it with, when you start up Contour, there is a command line thing that you can say that sets the namespaces that you can put what we call root HTTP proxies into. That's like the equivalent of gateway of like routes, HTTP routes that specify an FQDN.
Yeah.
A little bit similar. Yeah, so that's how we solved this problem, was that we just made it a config item on the controller that said that, only those things. I can see in this case, it probably would make some sense, I guess, to have the namespace selector thing or something like that. Yeah, I mean, that's basically, if the default behavior is, hey, we look in all namespaces because this is an object reference.
It has to be nil explicitly to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So I think it's better to have the default be that you don't look in all namespaces, and then you look in the current namespace, and then you do the and then if you put in a namespace selector, then it will look in other namespaces.
Yeah, I think the label selector actually has that behavior. Is like a little bit strange if you look at how it works. It's like if it's nil, it selects all. If it's like some weird ternary thing.
Yeah.
Luckily, it's consistent, but not necessarily super understandable. But I guess you only have to explain it once to people who use Kubernetes.
Yeah. I mean, if it's going to be a selector, it should behave like the other selectors. Yes, but it does mean that it's a weird RBAC. It's a weird sort of, in the case of the namespace, it's kind of a slightly weird inversion of how you would expect the gateway to work. If you didn't think about it in the Kubernetes terms,
Yeah, I think you can make it. I have to look. There's another place where it uses the selector in all its glory. I think they default it to being there but not nil, so it gets around the fact that maybe it's this network policy. And basically, it's like the default is secure. Like we can make that to be true.
So it sounds like 203 then needs to be revised as well, basically saying if we don't specify a selector, line 203, where it says if we don't specify a selector, then all namespaces will be associated. And I think there's similar references with the other fields where it's kind of default open, and it sounds like I need to actually change that to be default closed.
Yeah, at least it should be very obvious. We should go also to look at how, like, I know network policy probably is bad example because it was default open for just like migration from non-network policy. But I think like there was a lot of discussion in network policy to basically make it more secure by default if you defined it, and they had to do some pointer juggling there. So we can, since we're coming up with this from the get-go, we can kind of avoid some of those issues.
One thing I would say as well is that you mentioned this was, based on how Istio does things, and they do have the label selection, but it's on a different object. We have the gateway is not selecting the routes. The routes are selecting the gateways, basically. So it's inverted.
All right, thanks for that.
Okay, so I think Damien, we can follow up on the issue, and then I would love to sort of get a first cut and then kind of play with it to get how this feels. And then Dan, you made a good point, like whether or not this is here or if it suffices to say like a third thing. The third thing, like the external thing, though, we should have a clear story around that, because otherwise we're kind of leaving a very common use case, sort of like, oh, you do it yourself, but we should have some kind of story like, oh, you do it yourself, but this is going to be the obvious path that you're going to take. Okay. And I think, yeah, like, I'll reply on this issue. I feel like we should try hard to not have cluster scoped objects, because they just seem to be like sort of like the global variable kind of smell, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with that one. Giving people cluster scoped access is generally not a good idea. Okay, so moving on to, I think we had a pretty interesting discussion yesterday. I can pull it up. Give me 1 second. I need to join the Zoom. Here we go. This thing.
I'm gonna share your screen.
Yeah, but let me get in the Zoom. This is the future. Except open. Okay, I think I'm in. Okay. All right. And then if I share, hopefully I can do this. All right. Does this work?
It's promising.
Sort of.
Halfway.
Why is it dark? Oh, there we go. All right. Yeah. Sorry, Nick, this is going to be a reprise, but I'll make it quick. So there was a lot of discussion about how sort of what are these resources and like what they're doing. So if we take an analogy from how Ingress is working, so now that Ingress has gone GA, thanks to Rob and Chris and everyone else, we have Ingress class, which kind of describes an infrastructure. For example, it could describe like a proxy deployment, or it could describe like a cloud-based deployment. And then, for a proxy deployment, you're going to have some proxy configuration that generates. For cloud deployment, you kind of have the same thing, but it's through the cloud API, and generates like cloud objects. And then you're going to have a bunch of ingresses that use that class that sort of describe what the user intent is. Like they want to create a load balancer that serves host foo, var, VAS, and so forth. And then these are all mapped into the proxy deployment somehow, and on the cloud side, they'll be mapped in the cloud configuration. If you look at how the objects are kind of laid out, we have ingress class goes to gateway class. Again, keeping the role of sort of describing the infrastructure. Like this infrastructure is available as this class. You do not necessarily need to understand all the details inside how the infrastructure works, but you can basically reference this class and it has certain properties. The ingress object itself now, because we wanted to get some of this RBAC permission model and basically make it more fine-grained to have delegation and so forth, we've broken into sort of gateway, which has a listener and list of routes, and then a list of routes associated with it. And if you look at sort of continuing the analogy, again, gateway class maps to the infrastructure, and then the gateway plus the routes map to the user intent. The user wants to, again, create foo.com, bar.com, and baz.com, and then these gateways will map into, in this case, a Proxy deployment, it would map to kind of something similar. Like, I have Acme here, but really this is how like a lot of like Nginx and HA, I think all like work like this. They basically combine all the ingresses together, and then they form a configuration. The interesting piece of this is that the gateway is not a description of the infrastructure, which is this gray box up here. The gateway class is the description of the infrastructure to some extent. From the user standpoint, this is really a description of their intent, their requirements of what they want for their application. So we've had a lot of discussion about how, what should go into a gateway. Like, should you explicitly say in the listener, like, you should bind to 000, and like other properties that are very specific to the actual deployment. My claim is that it is sort of like, if you do it this way, it is very much more portable, and you're capturing more sort of like the user intent driven description of their application rather than saying explicitly like a certain infrastructure. One consequence of this, and I am writing this up, unfortunately I was on a plane yesterday night, so I didn't get a chance to write it up, was basically most typical users, like, they would say, have a gateway, and then they could leave the listener block empty, or they could say, I require a HTTP port, but I don't, like, it's up to the gateway class to kind of figure out how that's bound, what the external IP is, and so forth. And then a description of the infrastructure in some portable manner would appear in the status of the gateway. Basically, that's like the infrastructure taking this gateway class and then saying, hey, I can implement this based on the requirements and the intent that the user has given me, and here is how it was implemented, and it will basically put sort of a description of how that infrastructure has been implemented into the status section of the gateway. And it feels to me like if we do it that way, it would be way more, people can write a lot more generic specifications that could be portable to different infrastructures. Thinking about it, it's like kind of how Kubernetes APIs are. Like, a pod is something that is a description of your intent. You may want to bind to a certain class of storage. You may require a certain class of node, but you never explicitly say like what is on the node. At least we should strive to do that, because it imposes like scheduling constraints on the pod and so forth. And it's up to, for example, the Kubernetes system and this pod scheduler to then materialize that somehow. Like, the pod is going to be scheduled on a particular VM with particular attributes. Let's say pod requested GPU, and then that will be reflected in the pod status. Like, the pod mounted a particular volume with a given speed that they need, and then the actual volume name and the device it's attached to will appear in the status. So I know that this is somewhat of a conceptual like tweak, I guess, and it wasn't, I have to admit, it wasn't very well explained probably in the sketch, but this is kind of at least my thought process of what the resources correspond to. And then we had a very nice discussion yesterday, I think, going over kind of what the consequences of this are. So I know a couple of folks were not here yesterday, so this will probably be new material. And I apologize, Nick, like we're kind of rehashing this thing.
It's fine. I actually think it's really useful to explain it to everybody again. The way that I thought of it after we talked about it a bit, Bowie, was it's kind of, the other thing that we could think of it like is that a gateway is kind of like, although I wouldn't want to call it this because there's other overloaded stuff about it, but it's almost like a gateway claim rather than a gateway. We don't.
Yeah.
The fact of a claim is that you create the claim and then a controller creates a separate thing. But like, it's more like we're kind of taking the claim and the claim is the spec, and the object that gets created is the status.
Right.
But yeah, it's actually more like the idea of a PVC versus a PV than than what I originally thought, which was that the gateway spec is what defines what you want to listen on.
Yeah, I think unfortunately the claim is like a little bit strange, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. No, it's more just trying to not trying another way to explain what we were talking about. That's all.
Although I think we should reference it sort of in the understanding. So like the power of it is that for like, let's say a user says, I want a gateway, I want it to serve port 80, HTTP, and HTTPS. And those are my requirements. Like if they then had to write down like bind 000 because they're using HA proxy or something that's deployed in a local cluster, then it's like you can't ever port that to a cloud because cloud has no concept of like binding to that port. And then it's like that wasn't their intent. And if you look at how Ingress works, their intent is really to serve up this HTTP thing, HTTP/HTTPS thing, like, and then sort of it's up to the infrastructure to kind of provide how did it get served up, and then B, how was it through a service IP that then went to a proxy, or was it through a cloud load balancer, and like those things were not decisions immediately made by sort of the user describing it. Any thoughts on this model? I think I'm going to make it, I'm writing up some documentation around it so we can all comment. I'll keep it as a Google Doc for now. I don't know how easy it is to interpret a PR.
Yeah, I agree. I haven't started, but I got distracted by some other stuff. But yeah, I intend on updating that notes on the service APIs document that I started today as well. And the other thing I wanted to do was give people a chance in there to sort of say, like, in there I wanted to put like, the short descriptions plus like a slightly longer description for each object, and then have a space so that people can like make up like we can strawman different models in case in case people don't want to do it this way. Right. I agree by that. I actually, now that I've thought about it a bit more, I actually agree that because the scope of this particular thing is a lot larger than what the old Ingress one is, then it makes sense to do it this way. But it is going to mean that some of the stuff that people do to hit the current Ingress scope might be more complicated than the Ingress thing. But again, we talked about that yesterday. That Ingress is not going away. That we should be clear to people that, hey, if Ingress meets your use case, and you don't need a whole lot of annotations on your Ingress objects to make everything work, then there's no reason to move away from Ingress. This is to cover the why do I have to have all these annotations kind of use cases.
Right. And I mean, there are some, I know like we are always attracted to clever things, but our users may not appreciate it. But there are like, if you have this model, you can actually have some interesting use cases. For example, this came up like a year or 2 years ago, probably, where basically, I think one of the cloud providers they basically had infrastructure, but it was bandwidth bound. So then you would have to do some kind of scheduling or attachment and like stuff like that. I think it kind of admits some more interesting aspects to it. The downside, which James brought up yesterday, was that now it's like, it could be the case that something works on one infrastructure versus a different infrastructure. Unfortunately, I think that's something we're going to have to accept because the infrastructures do have different abilities. So that's something that, unfortunately, just like a trade-off that we need to make to say that this is portable. And then to kind of finish off the conversation, we had a discussion about whether or not that we could sort of split the world of implementations of the infrastructure into two major groups. One of them is like a cloudish one, and one of them is like a proxy-ish one, and then they sort of make that explicit in the API somehow, either by communicating it in the gateway class somehow as a status. So UI or users can like explicitly know what they're getting into. That one would be good to kind of go through that a little bit to see like what people would do with that information, and like how that would be, if we reflected in the API, how that would be consumed and what the sort of outcome of that would be. Any thoughts?
I found the description really helpful today. Thank you for that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, we'll be, I'll send out something about this, and then once we get some kind of convergence, we can update the concept doc. One thing I'm thinking is that we should just, like if everyone is like generally okay, but there's like some nasty like things that we might just want to sort of run with it a little bit, and then with the proviso that we can change it because it's still at an early stage, and then kind of like understand what the drawbacks are, pull it back. So
yeah, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to spend a little bit of time on like being able to write the short version of the description for each thing, because in my mind, being able to write a short description of something means that you have like conceptual clarity around what the thing actually is and does.
right.
If you can't summarize it in a sentence, then you don't really understand what it is.
Right. Yeah, so let's just play with this in our minds, and then we'll try to like sort through some of the consequence of it. And if we're generally okay with some format of this, then we can kind of move forward, because we have the rest of the API actually to go through. So just do a quick first pass, and then we should put a giant disclaimer like, hey, we're testing things out, you know, things may not work out, but we should like get to a point where we're playing with it and understanding, because it's really when you actually start playing with it and setting it up that you're like, oh, of course, like we shouldn't have done this.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get Contour's support for this wired in as soon as possible. By the way, that the status update there is that PR is ready to go, but we're going to cut a Contour release today. So I didn't want to get it in before then. It'll come in the next Contour release, which will be
awesome. Wait, how often does Contour release?
About a month. So
okay.
So there'll be an experimental service APIs flag that will watch the type for you, and we'll just log that it has seen them right now. But the idea here is just to get all the wiring in place so that as we actually define behavior, I can implement the behavior really easily by
nice. Cool.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that way there will be a proxy-ish way to try this out very quickly, hopefully.
Awesome. I'm going to stop sharing. I will share the slides along with, I'll notate it because I haven't put the speaker notes in there, and then expect the doc at some point. Let's see.
I would guess the question that I would ask everybody who hasn't talked already is, did that change your mental model much of what you were thinking about the objects? Maybe Daniel, I know that you've done a lot of work with them. Did that change your mental model a little?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I had a pretty good understanding of the model. I can't really say that it changed it all that much.
Yeah, cool. Because for me, it was I was very much thinking that the listener was much more of a spec than it actually is. That's why I asked, and that's one of the reasons why I've been arguing some things in the way that I had, was because I kind of had this different idea than what the things actually were.
I do like how you mentioned that, gateway spec is really like a gateway claim.
Yeah.
Right. It's, the gateway itself is represented in status.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think is really important to note somewhere is that what it means is that the controller that implements the gateway class, the behavior of a particular gateway will be different depending on which gateway class which controller that implements the particular gateway class it's associated with and how that behaves. And so the way that I was actually doing a dev training about it today, and the way I came to with him about it was that the gateway class implementation, it's almost like it defines like a little bit. It's like an interface contract for the gateway. In that the gateway, the configuration that's on the gateway class and the status. If we do the status thing, the status that's on the gateway class should tell you about how the gateway will behave given particular configuration. So an example of that is whether or not the multiple gateways is merged into a single config in the end or not, and some other. I think there should be other. They're not conditions, but they'll have condition-like behavior. I think that that tell you about what the sorts of behaviors that the gateway class implements.
I think it's that is like key, and we should pick out the ones that we feel like would let us describe it pretty completely, at least from the portable core basis. Yeah. And that would be awesome. Like, what if we could do that, and that one kind of would then, from the user perspective, like say like, hey, you see this, and then this is what you should expect.
Yeah, so that was the other big thing for me was the realization that the gateway behavior is actually dependent on the combination of the controller that implements the gateway class, and that's why I'm using that very specific language, because it's like having a struct that implements an interface in Go. There's a controller that implements the gateway class, and that means that we need to expose the actual contract of what that controller is going to do with like two gateways on that gateway class somehow, in the same way that an interface in Go exposes a contract of what function should be available.
I'm going to steal that and put it in the notes. Okay. Looks like we're almost out of time for this session. I know, Daniel, you weren't able to make the office hours, but I think we'll just make it a thing. So we'll just have more meetings.
Yeah, I didn't realize the office hours was going on yesterday. As I mentioned, I was tied up in some other things, so I need to go back. I think it was a couple days ago. I looked at the mailing list and didn't see anything about the office hours, so I need to. I assume you did post that information to the mailer.
I did, but you probably missed it. Also, like a bunch of folks here were traveling, so it was kind of like we were scrambling to get a room. I'll post something today to make it regular time, and then we should expect like basically office hours, regular meeting, and then just flipping it back and forth, and then hopefully we can make rapid progress on this.
That sounds great. Thanks for setting up the office hours. So
all right,
I'll look at the notes. Thanks.
All right, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Bowie.
See ya.